On July 15, 1976, an empty school bus was found in the middle of a tall bamboo thicket growing in a dry riverbed just outside of Chowchilla, California. Police were dumbstruck. There was no indication of how it ended up here in the middle of nowhere, nor any footprints from the 26 missing children who should have been on it. Police searched far and wide for these children, in every direction. But the one direction they never considered was down, underground. The last time the bus had been seen was earlier that day when it left a local pool to bring kids home after a day of swimming. The trip started as expected, but then, at approximately 4 p.m., the bus driver, Ed Ray, spotted a white van parked across the middle of the road with its door open. There were drainage ditches on either side of the narrow road, so, with no way around the van, Ed slowed the bus down to a stop. Besides, perhaps the van had broken down and whoever owned it needed help. But this theory was quickly shattered when 3 men armed with a pistol and a sawed-off shotgun jumped out of the white vehicle wearing pantyhose over their heads, distorting their features into something terrifying and faceless. One of the armed men tapped on the bus's door with his gun and, with an eerie calmness, asked Ed to open it, the complete lack of intimidation in his voice throwing off the driver even more. Ed Ray had an important decision to make at this moment. If he opened that door, he'd be letting potential terrorists into the vicinity of young, vulnerable children. There was no way of knowing what their intentions were, but seeing as they were the type of people who had no problem pointing their guns at a bus full of terrified children, it couldn't be good. But if Ed didn't comply with them, who knew what monstrosities they were capable of? Either way, the kids' lives were in grave danger. Presented with this impossible choice, Ed tried his best to keep a steady demeanor and hesitated for only a moment before opening the door and letting the men aboard. He hoped that by complying with the men's demands, he could de-escalate the situation somehow. With the lives of 26 innocent kids on the line, nothing was more important than their safety. The armed men quickly seized control of the bus. One of the men pulled Ed out of his seat and took the wheel. The second man pointed his shotgun at Ed and the kids, corralling them to the back of the bus, while the third man hopped back into the white van to follow the bus from behind. The bus began to move as the kids stared down the double barrels and began to worry if they'd ever be seeing their families again. That was probably the first time most of those kids ever saw a gun, and they were at the wrong end of it. Larry Park, who was 6 years old at the time, specifically wondered how it was going to feel to die. The men drove the bus a short distance before steering it off the road and into a thicket of bamboo taller than the bus itself. When the bus came to a halt, the front door was opened as the van backed up to it with its back doors open. The man with the shotgun started barking orders to the terrified kids. He forced them to form a line and hop from the bus door directly onto the white van so there would be no footprints left on the ground. The kidnappers forced 12 kids into the van one by one and then closed its doors. At the front of the line of the remaining kids was 10-year-old Jody Heffington, who watched her friends being driven off into the unknown while the cold metal of the kidnapper's shotgun was pressed into her stomach. She said, "I had to stand there with this gun in my gut until that one van drove away and they backed the second van up. It felt like forever. I thought he was going to shoot me. I actually did." The second van was like the previous one, except dark green. When Jody hopped into it, she realized it wasn't any ordinary van. It was like a mobile prison. It had been carefully modified for the exact purpose of transferring them all from one place to another without anyone noticing. The rear windows were painted black, and the entire interior was sealed with soundproof paneling. Even if they tried screaming for help on the way, no one would be able to hear or see them. After the remaining 14 kids and Ed were forced inside, the van door was locked behind them. There was no ventilation, no source of light, and nothing to eat or drink. In the midst of July, the California heat had no mercy. The young ones had started to cry from feeling suffocated inside the pitch-dark small van. They would bang where the driver's panel was and plead with them to let them out, only to hear a cold "shut up" from the other side. Ed Ray tried his best to keep the kids calm so as not to aggravate the kidnappers, but there was only so much he could do. The kids had been on their way home from a day of swimming at the local fairgrounds pool as part of the Dairyland Elementary School's summer program, and many of the kids were still in their swimming clothes. Then, 9-year-old Jennifer Brown Hyde was also doing her best to stay strong for those younger than her. A few of my little friends that are 5 and 6, they came over and started laying on me and crying. I told them, "Be brave, because it's going to be all right." But of course, On the inside, she was also terrified, saying, "I felt like I was an animal going to the slaughterhouse." As soon as the kids were 15 minutes late returning home, their parents knew something was wrong. In all his 26 years as a bus driver, Ed had never been late. So, needless to say, when the bus didn't show up, parents got worried. They tried to give it the benefit of the doubt that maybe there had been a delay at the pool. But as minutes turned into hours, panic set in, and the small community sprang into action. Chowchilla was a small farming town where no one locked their doors and hardly anything too sensational ever happened. So to the sudden disappearance of that many people, particularly children, was a shock to say the least. But the community was ready to work together and do whatever it took to bring their children home. Citizens with CB radios coordinated with one another and drove vehicles all over the county, scouring roads, fields, and orchards for any sign of the bus or Ed and the kids. No one knew what was going on, and everyone was on edge. Parents weren't letting their kids out of the house, and by 6:30 p.m., about 2.5 hours after the children were last seen, with still 0 leads found by search parties on the ground, the sheriff's department dispatched a plane to search from the air. With tensions mounting and the clock ticking, it was as if the earth swallowed them whole. But then again, soon, that wouldn't be far from reality. After spending 11 agonizing hours of fainting in and out of consciousness while in complete darkness with no food, water, fresh air, or any idea where they were going and when they'd get there, the van stopped. The next few moments were agonizing, just waiting in the pitch black silence to find out what horrible fates the men had in store for them. The van doors opened and flashlights shone in their faces. As the children cowered in fear and shielded their sensitive eyes from the blinding light, the kidnappers forced Ed Ray out of the van and closed the doors. When they opened again, Ed was nowhere to be seen. Seeing the only grown-up disappear into the unknown, the kids started to panic. The kidnappers proceeded to hastily pull the closest kid out and slam the doors shut, only to open them again moments later to grab the next victim, never showing any indication of what had become of the previous one. As 10-year-old Jody says, "I thought they were basically killing us each one at a time." By the time it was Jody's turn, she was the only kid left in the van. When she was pulled out, the girl couldn't see any of her friends. Had they killed them? If not, then where were they? A sudden bright light on her face forced her to squirm her eyes shut. One of the kidnappers, who was holding a greasy Jack-in-the-Box hamburger wrapper and a pen, began to ask her questions. They said, "What's your name?" And I have a little bit of a smartass in me, and I said, "Puddentane. Ask me again and I'll tell you the same." I was pissed and I was scared at the same time. They said, "If you don't tell us your name, you're never going to see your mom and dad again. Do you understand?" And they took all my belongings, and then they said, "You're going to go down in this hole right here." The hole was only big enough to let one person pass through at a time, but from above, it looked like it opened into a space much wider. There was a ladder that descended into the darkness, but it was hard to tell just how deep it went or what was waiting for her at the bottom. In the other van, 14-year-old Michael Marshall, who was the oldest of them all, had been trying to keep the younger kids calm throughout the ordeal. A small 5-year-old girl named Monica Ardrey clung to his side as she saw her friends being dragged out. Eventually, it was only the two of them left, and her tiny fingers dug holes into his shirt, her wide eyes begging him to stay and not leave her behind, all alone. But Michael had no idea what awaited them outside the van door. So unwilling to send the little girl off to what could be her death, he decided to go first. I had to take her hands from mine and rip and tear them apart, say it would be okay, and go with them and leave her. That was hard, said Michael. The imagination of a child could be wondrous, but in a situation like this, it only made their fear worse. Staring down the hole, Michael's mind raced. What horrors were waiting below for them in this ominous black pit? With his heart beating into his ears, he slowly climbed down the ladder, awaiting his fate. But then he heard voices. "It's Mike. It's Mikey. Michael." The kids were still alive. Once Michael reached the bottom of the ladder and was able to take a look at his surroundings, what he saw shocked him. At first, it seemed like he had entered some kind of room or bunker that had been built underground. But then, upon closer inspection, it seemed to actually be some sort of trailer or moving truck that had been buried underground. It was equipped with minimal basic supplies. There were some worn-out mattresses, a couple of water jugs, a stale loaf of bread, peanut butter, and cereal. A few dim lights were strung up, casting a faint, eerie glow in the otherwise dark, claustrophobic space. 2 PVC pipes were stuck in through the ceiling, and the children could hear fans, so they assumed they were for ventilation. The kidnappers had also carved holes into the wheel wells of the trailer to act as makeshift toilets. It was crude and barely functional, but it was all they cared to provide. It was clear that their goal wasn't comfort, it was control. After little Monica became the last child to descend the ladder, and all 26 children and Ed were together again, the kidnappers threw down a single roll of toilet paper and called down, "We'll be back for you." Then they closed the hole with a hatch, draining the outside light from the already dark space. Then a loud thud came from above, then another, followed by the sounds of dirt being piled on top of them. As Michael puts it, we were being buried alive. However, what the prisoners and even their abductors failed to realize was that while the men were busy sealing the hole and piling dirt on top of it, they sealed the ventilation pipes as well. The air source to 27 people trapped 12 feet underground was now cut dreadfully short. To make matters even worse, underground, Ed noticed something horrifying. The walls and roof were bending inwards from the weight of all the dirt on top of them, and it looked like as if they would cave in at any moment. Ed chose not to say anything to the children, who were already terrified enough, but he knew that it was only a matter of time before this prison became their tomb. Just before sunset, the sheriff's department's search plane finally discovered the missing school bus. It was parked in a dry slough off Avenue 21, about 7 miles outside Chowchilla, hidden under a canopy of bamboo and eucalyptus trees. The scene was unsettling. The bus was empty, with no trace of the driver or the children. Worse yet, there were no clear clues to guide the investigation, not even footprints to confirm if the kids were ever there. However, there were tire tracks showing that a vehicle had been backed up to the bus's door. Madera County Sheriff Ed Bates rushed to the scene to inspect it further and confirmed every parent's worst nightmare. The kids were most likely taken, a mass kidnapping the likes of which America had never seen before. That evening, Chowchilla came to a standstill. Parents, friends, and neighbors gathered in the churches, schools, and town halls to hold vigils, praying for the safe return of their children. President Gerald Ford, hearing the case, immediately authorized all law enforcement agencies to spare no expense in the search. California Governor Jerry Brown issued a similar order, directing resources across the state. Soon, every white van or abandoned children's shoe became a potential lead, and every tip was pursued with urgency. Seeing the magnitude of the tragedy, the FBI was brought in to take over the investigation, flooding the small town with agents and resources. They booked every available room in Chowchilla's 2 motels, turning them into temporary command centers. Reporters from across the state swarmed the small town. Cameras flashed endlessly while rumors spiraled into wild theories. Who was behind such a heartless act? And why? And why had there been no ransom calls yet? Some speculated that it might be a group that wants recognition and money, while others theorized international terrorists. The entire nation was watching, waiting, and wondering, would the children be found alive? Meanwhile, inside the hole, it became increasingly stifling, with no ventilation and dirt falling from above, as well as the musty stench of damp earth and gasoline lingering in the air. It was quickly becoming harder and harder to breathe. The kids were exhausted from the long, sweltering ride in the vans, and the little food and water they were given had already run out and had not at all been able to satiate their hunger and thirst. With stomachs rumbling and their mouths parched, they cried, waiting, hoping for someone to save them. The heat was becoming impossible to bear, slowly turning the cramped, dark space into an oven. Sweat clung to the children's skin, mixing with dirt that rained down from the ceiling above whenever they moved too much. At first, the kids tried to stay strong. They sang songs and cheerful tunes to distract themselves from the crushing fear. But as time dragged on and hope began to fade, the lyrics twisted into sorrowful parodies of the nursery rhymes they once loved. A few children weakly clapped their hands to the haunting, altered words, "If you're sad and you know it, clap your hands." It was clear that their energy was fading. 10-year-old Linda Carriejo Labandera described their home for the night as a giant coffin for all of us, and the poor girl wasn't far from the truth. But Ed Ray, their bus driver, refused to let them sink into hopelessness. Though he was just as terrified, he knew he had to be their rock. The man moved from child to child, offering quiet words of comfort, patting their backs and wiping away tears. He encouraged them to rest so they could save their energy and stay calm. But as hours passed, their prison began to feel smaller from the weight of the earth pressing down from above. Some of the youngest children, barely old enough to understand what was happening, curled up in a corner and whimpered for their parents. After 16 hours of being locked in that buried trailer with little to no lighting, the sole adult among the kids was losing the last bit of his strength. Just then, a creaking noise woke him from his hopeless trance. He looked up and saw that the previously bent roof of the trailer was now U-shaped, close to giving out at any point. The kids began screaming when dirt started seeping into the trailer from all sides at a faster rate, almost blinding them. Their worst fear was coming true. If they didn't get out of the trailer now, they were going to be buried alive, and no one would ever find them. Their families would never know what happened to them. Michael says, "The thing that made me cry was not being able to say goodbye to my mom, and I'm remembering the last time I saw her and wishing I could have told her goodbye." The children clung to Ed Ray for reassurance, but he was stuck in a dilemma. Even if they managed to get out of there, they might just find themselves face to barrel with the kidnappers' guns. 14-year-old Michael, the oldest of the batch, was willing to take the chance to save his friends no matter what awaited them outside. He thought to himself, if we're going to die, we're going to die getting the hell out of here. The sealed hatch at the top was their only way out of the buried trailer. Time was of the essence. He needed a plan and a way to reach that hole before the interior broke down entirely. Just then, his eyes fell on the old mattresses the kidnappers had left in the truck for kids to lie on. He quickly dragged them and put them on top of each other one by one. The kids watched Michael with intrigue in their eyes, not knowing what was going on in the teenager's mind. Michael jumped on top of the stacked mattresses, happy that he could finally reach the top. He pushed with all his might, but the flame of hope in his eyes slowly flickered away when, even after pushing multiple times, the seal didn't budge. The dirt kept piling up like the bottom half of a sand timer, and it seemed as if the thing blocking their only way out was impossible to move. Just when he was about to give up, an adult hand reached from the side and pushed at the sealed hatch. Ed had joined in the struggle, and both of them were now pushing at the sealed latch together with all their strength. The cover began shifting, and with each inch it moved, it restored faith in the kids' hearts. Maybe there was a way for them to survive this. But the hatch was stubborn. It wouldn't open all the way. That's when Michael grabbed a loose wooden beam from the underground chamber and jammed it into the small gap they had created. Using it as leverage, he and Ed pressed with everything they had. The metal groaned under the pressure. Then, with one final push, the hatch broke free, and two giant 100-pound batteries their kidnappers had placed on top of the hole covering to keep them trapped crashed down into the truck with a loud thud, thankfully not hitting any children in the process. But this was no time to rejoice because, although the seal was open, the young ones had another challenge to face. They got rid of the batteries and the metal sheet, but instead of an open sky, they saw another barrier, a large reinforced plywood box. The kidnappers had placed it over the entrance and secured it with heavy dirt and debris, sealing them underground. No matter how daunting, this new obstacle didn't shake young Michael as he climbed up into the box and began pounding at the walls of the box and digging at the packed earth surrounding the edges of the plywood. He dug feverishly, his hands raw, shoving dirt aside as quickly as he could. The other children joined in, scraping at the earth, widening the gaps. Then, finally, a large chunk of dirt crumbled and tumbled down the hatch. That's when they saw it. The most glorious ray of sunlight that I had ever seen, as 6-year-old Larry Park recalled. Michael was the first to poke his head out. Ed and the kids managed to dig their way out of their makeshift coffin one by one. But stepping out into the world again didn't feel entirely like salvation. What if their kidnappers were nearby, ready to strike again? Were they just stepping out of the frying pan and into the fire? They had no idea where their kidnappers were, and the unfamiliar surroundings only heightened their anxiety. The children stood amidst a barren, rocky landscape, surrounded by towering mounds of excavated dirt. Massive conveyor belts stretched across the site like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast, their rusted metal frames casting long, jagged shadows. The children scurried like mice through the rugged terrain, their small figures weaving around abandoned excavators that to 9-year-old Jennifer looked like something out of the Flintstones. Then they heard footsteps. Every muscle in their bodies tensed. Had the kidnappers come back to finish what they started? Their breath hitched as the sound grew closer. A man stood staring at them in disbelief. Was he one of the kidnappers? He looked at them as if he'd seen a ghost, and when he got close to them, he said, "This world's been looking for you." Their bodies eased. He wasn't a kidnapper. The man wasted no time contacting the authorities. Within minutes, sirens cut through the cool breeze of the night. The children were exhausted, covered in dirt, running on nothing but adrenaline. When the Alameda County sheriffs arrived, they moved fast. No more waiting, no more questions, just action. They loaded the kids into vehicles and took them to the closest facility with medical staff, which was Santa Rita Rehabilitation Center. Now, imagine being a kid and pulled up to a jail after surviving something like this. Barbed wire, guard towers, it would have looked terrifying. However, once inside, things started to feel safer. The kids were given apples and soda, quite simple snacks, but to them, it felt like a feast. Doctors checked them over, EMTs wrapped them in blankets, and for the first time in nearly 2 days, someone was taking care of them. Still, the ordeal wasn't over. The police needed answers. Each child was questioned separately and asked to describe everything. What the kidnappers looked like, what they said, how they escaped. Finally, after 4 hours of long and tiring interrogation to identify the culprits, the kids were taken home. Ironically, they had to board another bus to travel back to Chowchilla, where everyone waited for them. For the kids to be able to return home almost 32 hours after the most traumatic experience of their lives, it felt unreal to be able to see their families again. When they pulled up to Chowchilla, they were swarmed with flashing camera lights. The townspeople gathered all around, crying and rejoicing at the kids' safe return. But while the town was overjoyed, for the kids, this horrifying incident wasn't going to leave them anytime soon. Amidst the chaos, 2 questions remained in everyone's minds. Who was behind such a catastrophe? And where were they right now? The media was in a frenzy, and the authorities raced for answers. They began their investigation by finding answers to the basic questions first, like who had access to the quarry where the kids were buried. Since it was private property, entry was restricted, and only a handful of people had legitimate access. Among them, one name stood out: Frederick Woods. Wood's family owned the quarry, and he not only had unrestricted access but also possessed the keys to the exact area where the buried truck was found. This was crucial because while other workers and security personnel had access to parts of the quarry, few could enter that specific location without permission. From there, the case unfolded rapidly. As detectives dug deeper, the quarry's security guards came forward with a striking piece of intel. Months before the crime, they had witnessed 3 young men digging a massive hole in that same area. At the time, it seemed odd but not necessarily suspicious, until now. With Woods already under scrutiny, investigators suspected he was one of the 3. To confirm their theory and uncover the identities of his accomplices, they combed through property records, employment logs, and any existing surveillance footage. It didn't take long for them to discover that the other 2 members were, in fact, Woods' old friends, the brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. All 3 criminal masterminds actually belonged to wealthy and influential families in the San Francisco Bay Area. 24-year-old Frederick Newhall Woods IV's father owned a vast estate in Portola Valley, complete with the rock quarry. Despite his wealth, Frederick was a troubled young man. He had been arrested for petty theft before and was described as lazy and entitled, a product of his upbringing in a world where money often shielded him from much-needed consequences. The other 2 men were brothers, 24-year-old James Schoenfeld and 22-year-old Richard Schoenfeld. Both were sons of a respected podiatrist, John Schoenfeld, in Atherton. They were also childhood friends with Frederick. James was known for being intelligent but impulsive, often leading to trouble. On the other hand, Richard, the youngest of the trio, was quieter and deeply influenced by his older brother. Unsurprisingly, they didn't have a clean record to begin with. They were previously charged with the Grand Theft Auto, but given their powerful backgrounds, they were able to get away with it. Now, these 3 had committed the largest kidnapping in the history of America. But what could their motive be when they were already from rich families? Well, you see, their families had actually just recently cut them off. For years, as adults, they had been living off sizable monthly checks from their wealthy parents. But eventually, their parents decided that they were tired of their son's lack of apparent drive to support themselves and become accomplished in their own right. So now, in order to pay off their quickly mounting debt while still being able to maintain their lifestyles they were used to, the 3 men began looking for a get-rich-again-quick scheme. Frederick was the one to first suggest that the fastest way to walk away with millions would be to hold children hostage and demand the state for ransom money. Little kids didn't have the power to fight back, and anyone would go to great lengths to ensure their safety. And to the Dairyland students' misfortune, they were the ones the hijackers decided to target. The three criminals had been preparing for their sinister crime for more than a year. In their minds, they had gone over every little detail to make their plan a success. This time, however, no money or planning was going to save them. With search warrants in hand, authorities raided the Woods family estate in Portola Valley, and what they discovered left them astounded. A chilling collection of evidence lay sprawled across Frederick Woods' room. A document labeled Plan was found that had a layout of every step of the whole kidnapping. Now, common sense isn't a flower that grows in every garden, but if one is planning a kidnapping in secret, then something that sensitive shouldn't be labeled Plan and then just left lying around. It's almost as if they wanted to be caught. To make matters worse for the kidnappers, the investigators found a handwritten draft of the ransom note that they were planning to use. The demand on the note was for $2.5 million. However, authorities later discovered that the kidnappers actually intended to ask for $5 million, equivalent to roughly $27 million today from the state of California, a sum they deemed large enough to solve most of their troubles. Sheriff Ed Bates shared how, in their entire plan, the only clever thing was their escape plan. They were going to drive up the coast to someplace heavily wooded, then go back inland and have airplanes patrol for 200 miles up and down the area until they saw a certain series of lights indicating the drop site. Then, the money was to be dropped on them and they'd be gone. By the time they had the money, nobody would be able to get there. You just can't stake out 200 miles. Much to the kidnappers' dismay, they never even got the chance to ask for the money. After sealing their hostages 12 feet underground, the kidnappers had tried to make the ransom call, but to their misfortune, the Chowchilla Police Department lines had been jammed with people calling from all over the world to ask about the kids. After multiple failed attempts to reach the police department, the trio decided to call later and take a nap in the meantime. This sole decision of theirs changed the situation entirely. Amidst all this clear-cut evidence, the investigators also found journals, maps, receipts for the vans used in the abduction, and even one of the weapons used to hijack the school bus. And to top it all off, they found the Jack-in-the-Box hamburger wrapper with each kidnapped child's name and age scribbled on it. They also came across a rental contract for a storage unit. When the detectives on duty reached it, they found the kidnappers' getaway car, a Cadillac spray-painted in black night camouflage. There was even more evidence in the car trunk, like weapons and false identification documents for Frederick, proof that these men had meticulously planned everything. The kidnappers had thought they could outsmart the law, but just like the rabbit in the turtle race, they overestimated themselves and underestimated their hostages. The very next moment, arrest warrants against the three culprits were issued, and the authorities went on a wide search for them. The kidnappers woke from their nap to a nightmare of their own. The children had escaped. Their entire plan, which they had spent over a year plotting in excruciating detail, had collapsed in the time it took for them to sleep off their exhaustion. It was now their turn to panic. They had no ransom money, no leverage, and now the entire country was looking for them. Afraid to face the consequences of the mess they had created, the trio tried to flee. But they could only go so far because the authorities stopped at nothing to find the culprits behind the mass kidnapping. One of them, Richard Schoenfeld, realized there was no use running for the rest of his life and made the wiser choice. 8 days after the kids were found, he surrendered to Alameda County, California District Attorney Lowell Jensen. Richard was then arraigned on kidnapping charges in Chowchilla and held on $1 million bail. His brother James, on the other hand, wasn't as willing. Instead, he went on the run, desperately trying to evade the authorities. His escape attempt, however, was clumsy and full of missteps, leaving behind a trail that the authorities followed as easily as if it had road signs. On July 18th, 2 days after the kidnapping, James attempted to enter Canada through the Kingsgate border crossing in British Columbia, north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. But he faced an unexpected rejection from the immigration officers. They stated that his story about traveling for work was too vague and lacked sufficient details. James was frustrated. He drove to Spokane, Washington to gather some cash just in case. There, he sold 2 rifles, a shotgun, 2 pistols, and a large quantity of ammunition, receiving $180 in return. The next night, in desperation, he tried his luck again, this time at the Cascade, Washington border crossing, about 200 miles west of his previous attempt. As if the first rejection at the border wasn't clear enough, he was rejected once again. It was now day 3 of him desperately trying to escape his fate. James made a stop at a salvage yard in Coeur d'Alene, selling bolt cutters, tools, 2 pistols, and an electric drill for $135. He wasn't even using a fake identity. Each sale was made with his real California driver's license, the biggest mistake he could make. When the salvage yard owner saw James's name in the newspaper, he quickly alerted the police. Officers immediately sprang into action and began searching the area. By 2 a.m. on July 21st, they found the car he had been driving, an older model vehicle with California plates, parked empty in a residential neighborhood. Acting quickly, the police checked local motels and hotels while also scouring classified ads for used cars. Their persistence paid off when they discovered that James had purchased a 1950 Chevrolet van for $235. The FBI tracked the license number and a nationwide alert was issued. 2 weeks after the kidnapping, a trailer park employee named Lee R. Wallace gave a tip to the police that eventually led them to track James down. At around 7 a.m., Mr. Wallace had heard the radio broadcast of James driving the 1950 Chevrolet van with Idaho plates. Coincidentally, he came across the exact car while driving on the backcountry road near Milpitas, California. The park employee carefully followed the van after eventually getting off the freeway to call the police. Upon getting the lead, the cops quickly responded and began monitoring the freeway, which was the main route from San Francisco. Meanwhile, James was driving in his own world, unaware of what awaited him. As soon as his car showed up, 3 police cars began chasing him with blaring sirens. Seeing no way out, James pulled over off the Bayshore Freeway and was swiftly detained. Now, all that was left was to capture the mastermind behind it all, Frederick Woods. But he had already fled the United States, slipping across the border into Canada under a false identity. On July 17th, Woods arrived at Vancouver International Airport using a passport issued under the name Ralph Snyder, a name that authorities later discovered to be of a 6-year-old child who had died in 1960. When Canadian immigration officials questioned Woods, he refused to discuss matters in California, keeping his true identity and fugitive status hidden. He claimed he was only going to stay for 5 days, but officials soon realized he had overstayed his permit. With a tip from the FBI, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched a surveillance operation outside the Vancouver post office, where Woods was expected to appear. The officers kept a close watch. They even mistakenly detained 2 innocent German students, thinking of them as potential suspects. About half an hour later, Woods finally showed up. 5 officers swiftly surrounded him, arresting him on the spot. That same day, Woods was escorted to the Peace Arch border crossing at Blaine, Washington, where the FBI was waiting. Once all 3 men were in custody, everyone finally got the answers they had been seeking. These men weren't hardened criminals or part of any underground organization. They were privileged young men drowning in debt. Despite coming from wealthy families, James Schoenfeld later admitted, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back." But their dreams to restore the once lavish lifestyle they had were buried the moment those kids rose from their tomb 12 feet below. The kidnappers weren't getting a dime. The evidence against Fred Woods and the Schoenfeld brothers was overwhelming. They had unwittingly left behind a trail of clues, ransom notes, handwritten plans, even receipts for the underground truck. There was no saving them now, and all of them pled guilty to 27 counts of kidnapping for ransom and robbery. One might think that this is it, the happy ending everyone was looking for. The bad guys got served, but that's not how it went. Despite all the evidence for the kidnapping, there was one charge they refused to admit to: bodily harm. At the time, under Penal Code Section 209, the victims should have to attain a certain extent of visible physical injuries to be able to press charges accordingly. Why this particular charge was important was because, if convicted of causing bodily harm, the kidnappers would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. But if the defendant's side couldn't convict them of bodily harm, there was a terrifying chance that these men could one day walk free. The fight for justice was still not over. Just like how the kids didn't just sit still inside the buried truck and wait for rescue, they were ready to fight again and make sure their abductors would never have the chance of parole. In the court, the victims were once again standing face to face with their culprits. It was the first time they had seen them since the incident, and even after 16 months, the mere sight of them sent shivers down their spines. Jody Heffington, just 10 years old at the time, described the terror of standing in that courtroom. You're in this little box, and they're there looking at you, just glaring at you and staring you down. The trial began, and the brave kids recounted everything they went through, both emotionally and physically. Each cut, each bruise, and the prolonged states of dehydration and exhaustion. They tried their best not to show any sign of weakness as they recounted their worst nightmare before the court. Finally, the verdict was handed down. The judge sentenced all 3 men to life in prison without parole. The moment the judge's gavel hit the desk, a wave of celebratory cheers swept through the courtroom. It was over. Or so they thought. Just 4 years after the trial, the kidnappers' lawyers appealed the bodily harm charges once again, attempting to ease their sentence. It was the age where trauma was not seen as anything past physical damage. The most common symptom trauma survivors face is PTSD, and it wasn't until the 1980s that it was officially recognized as a mental health disorder. In the meantime, when it wasn't acknowledged, the California Court of Appeal ruled in the kidnappers' favor, resentencing them to lifetime imprisonment but with the possibility of parole. They failed to see the emotional scarring that each kid in that courtroom was sentenced to for life. Larry Park, one of the youngest victims, felt betrayed by the justice system. It felt like we were being kidnapped all over again, he later said. After the rescue, the children tried to return to their lives, but nothing was ever the same. 5 weeks after the ordeal, they were honored as heroes and taken to Disneyland, a trip meant to replace bad memories with good ones. But trauma isn't wiped away with a roller coaster ride. Jennifer Brown Hyde later admitted, "In a way, you try to be normal, but when you've gone through something that's so traumatic, it's hard to go back and be a normal kid again." Many of the children developed severe anxiety. Some slept with nightlights well into adulthood. Others struggled with addiction, depression, and failed relationships. The weight of their buried past never fully lifted. Jody Heffington became one of the most vocal survivors and struggled deeply. "Sometimes life is an act," she admitted. "You try to be good for everybody else so they don't worry, but they worry anyway, so I advise everybody else not to do it that way." She tried to put on a strong face for others, but the nightmares, the fear, the exhaustion never really left her. What followed the resentencing was a relentless cycle of hearings. Every few years, the survivors had to relive their trauma, sitting in the same room as their captors, again and again, fighting to keep them behind bars. For over 40 years, the battle continued. The Chowchilla kidnapping forced people to realize that psychological harm can be just as damaging as bodily harm, if not sometimes worse. The long-term effects of childhood trauma were finally acknowledged as the kidnapping became one of the first widely publicized cases where survivors openly discussed the psychological toll of their experience. For decades, Jody Heffington dedicated her life to preventing her kidnappers from walking free. She attended nearly every parole hearing, pleading with the board to remember what had happened, to understand that the wounds these men inflicted had never healed. At one of these hearings, inside a crowded parole boardroom, Jody finally came face to face with Fred Woods. Looking directly at him, she didn't hold back. "You're a thief of lives. Not just the kids that were in the bus, but they stole our families' lives, and what we all had before that." Yet, despite all their attempts to stop it, one by one, the kidnappers were released. Richard Schoenfeld was granted parole in June 2012 after serving 36 years. His release came after the California Board of Parole Hearings determined he was no longer a threat to society. He had maintained a clean record in prison, expressed deep remorse, and demonstrated good behavior, which played a significant role in securing his release. James Schoenfeld was paroled 3 years later in 2015. During his hearings, he admitted that the kidnapping had been fueled by greed and a sense of entitlement. Like his brother, he too participated in rehabilitation programs. The board found that he had shown genuine remorse and taken responsibility for his actions. These factors, along with his old age of 63 and lack of continued criminal behavior, contributed to his eventual release. But the criminal mastermind, Fred Woods, had a more difficult time convincing the board. Unlike the Schoenfeld brothers, Woods had multiple disciplinary violations in prison, including possessing contraband like pornography and cell phones. His repeated rule-breaking led to numerous parole denials over the years. But in 2022, after 46 years, he too was granted parole. At his final hearing, the board noted that he had secured employment opportunities and financial stability upon release. Despite objections from survivors and prosecutors, his old age, which was 70 years at the time, and perceived low risk of reoffending ultimately led to his parole being approved. Jody felt she had failed. After dedicating so much of her life to ensuring these men remained in prison, they were free. Her own life spiraled. The pain of the kidnapping, the frustration with the justice system, the weight of the survivor's guilt. It all became too much. She turned to drugs and alcohol to cope. Jody blamed herself for their release, and the weight of it all soon consumed her. In 2021, at the age of 55, Jody Heffington passed away. The cause of death was never officially released, but her son's words painted a tragic picture. She wouldn't eat because she was so depressed, and she basically just couldn't process life the way she was supposed to. While some survivors struggled, others eventually found a path to healing. Larry Park battled addiction and schizophrenia for years before finding sobriety. He became a pastor and eventually forgave his captors, saying, "My resentment for them was killing me. The moment I forgave them, I finally felt peace." Jennifer Brown Hyde built a happy life, though it took decades before she could sleep without a nightlight. That little girl that was kidnapped and buried alive managed to live a wonderful life, she said. Michael Marshall became a truck driver and a father. He never forgave the kidnappers. "What they put my mom and dad through is something I cannot forgive." The bus driver, Ed Ray, was awarded for his outstanding community service and heroism. Despite the sweltering heat and sheer terror, he kept reassuring the kids. He comforted the youngest and encouraged the older kids to stay strong. Anyone in his shoes at the time would have thought it impossible to keep all 26 kids from acting impulsively under fear. He made sure no one ran away or did anything that would aggravate the kidnappers. In the end, without him, the kids would have never been able to dig out of that hole and escape in one piece. The town of Chowchilla never forgot his sacrifice, and in his later years, he remained a beloved figure in the community. If it wasn't for Ray's steady leadership and quick thinking, who knows what would have happened? Ray passed away at the age of 91 on May 17, 2012, due to complications from liver psoriasis. Despite his health struggles in later years, he lived a long and fulfilling life, surrounded by family and a community that deeply respected him. To ensure his legacy lived on, Chowchilla also declared every February 26th, which was Ed's birthday, Edward Ray Day, honoring the man who stood between danger and the innocent lives in his care. The legacy of the Chowchilla kidnapping became a case study in PTSD, influencing how we understand and treat trauma survivors today. It eventually brought about changes in California Penal Code Section 209, leading to an increased penalty for kidnapping even if the victim was not harmed. The survivors did not just endure the horror of being buried alive, they endured decades of reliving it, fighting for justice, losing their friends in the process, and eventually proving to the world that what happened to them mattered. The kidnappers may be free today, claiming that they were apologetic for what they did, but the children they stole from will never fully escape what happened to them on that hot July afternoon in 1976. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel, as it really helps us to keep bringing more stories to you. Like this one, where we investigate why so many Amazon workers are dying. Click the video on your screen to watch now.